And thank you to Congressman Blumenauer and our other Commissioner Wellinghoff and our other distinguished guests. Many of you already know NDN. We are a Washington think tank that focuses on cutting-edge issues. These include globalization, the role of technology in politics, and we have a Hispanic initiative. The initiative I head up is the Green Project, which is concerned with climate change and building relationships among stakeholders and between stakeholders and the Washington policy process. So that's sort of who we are. And I now want to turn to our first speaker, who is Congressman Inslee. I think everyone in this room knows the leadership that Congressman Inslee has shown on these and many issues over the years, on the environment, on energy. But I would also say that if you haven't yet done so, that you read his book, which is entitled Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy, which is absolutely on target in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, let me introduce Congressman Inslee.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I may note that my book is being recommended by sleep therapists all over the country, too. So this is really a magic moment in the country. You look at this turnout today for this issue that maybe 6 years ago would have had just Earl and me and maybe Dave McCurdy in the room. And now you look at this turnout. The country has elected a visionary leader who understands that the development of a comprehensive grid system is absolutely integral to the growth of the American economy. A fellow who I think can really raise the country's eyes to the realm of the possible. And a third little element I'll note, I went to see the latest James Bond movie this weekend, and it has an environmental sort of green technology theme. Hydrogen fuel cells feature a prominent role in the movie. An effort to protect a significant amount of Brazilian or some Latin American company rainforest plays a prominent role in the movie. Now, that turned out to have been a fraud, but nonetheless, it was important. So when James Bond starts talking about the effort to build a new clean energy technology, we know we have arrived. I've actually heard the next James Bond movie is going to be called Greenfinger. It's going to be, it shows you how far we've advanced. But I think everyone in this room, it goes without saying that the development of a significant expansion both in the capacity and intellectual ability of our grid system is absolutely integral to all of the visions we need to accomplish. It is integral to the development of the plug-in hybrid vehicles, which we hope to be produced in this country. It is integral to the development of concentrated solar thermal energy in the Southwest. It is integral to the full exploitation of the wind power, which is enormous in the Midwest. We know that we have two great things in this country: enormous access to renewable energy, and the problem that nobody lives where those energy sources are. So we have another great resource to bring to bear, which is the one only ultimate renewable energy source, which is American intellectual innovative talent. And now is the moment to really put that to work to develop the new grid system to get that done. I don't have a total blueprint on how to do that, but I just want to throw out some ideas that I hope the next Congress and the administration will be looking at to really maximize this. And the capacity of this is tremendous. I remember sitting on a ferry boat. I live on a little island by Seattle. About 3 years ago, a guy came up to me named Dave Kaplan, retired from Microsoft a few years ago, started to look around for the next best big thing. And he said, you know, we're going to have electric cars that will be a part of the grid system. And to manage the distribution of that system, to use electric batteries as a storage system, we're going to need a software component to manage that relationship between the grid and the batteries in our cars at garages at night, where we're spinning wind turbines and feeding electricity into our batteries and renting our batteries to the utilities. So he says, I'm going to go out and build a company to manage that. And I said, wow, that's a pretty amazing concept. That was about 3 years ago. Well, 3 weeks ago, he sold his company for about $135 million to another smart grid component system that's going to be involved in this. And here is job creation that this guy started an industry out of thin air. And that's what we're going to see happening when we develop a grid system. I'll list 5 things that I think are worth discussion in the next several months. Number one, a system of developing a way to regionalize or spread the costs of the massive infrastructure that we need to build to relay, hopefully, the new advanced systems of the grid. I've introduced a bill that essentially does that. It's called the Rural Superhighways Electrification Bill or some such. I can't remember the exact language. That basically would regionalize the cost structure for building trunk lines to heavy wind or solar or someday wave or tidal power, essentially doing in a national basis what Texas has done to spread their costs statewide for the development of these trunk lines. Developing a more broad-based system of financing these massive grid improvements, I think, is necessary. I don't know that my bill is the only way to do it, but some way we have to find a way to expand the financial cost of these structures. Second, we clearly need a net metering bill that will help consumers feed back into the system, which is one way to maximize our plug-in hybrid cars. That relationship between the utility grid and either the storage or production of energy by consumers and small businesses is absolutely integral to really recognizing the full technological potential. I have a net metering bill I've been working on for years. That or some portion needs to pass at some point. Third, a very significant expansion of our R&D is in order here. The original Apollo project invested 6 to 8 times more on trying to put 2 guys on the moon than we're spending on helping 6 billion people here on the planet Earth keep a place that's habitable. We've total expenditures right now on R&D are about $3 billion in energy, including everything. The dog food industry in the United States invests more in R&D than all of the utilities put together in the United States of America. So we have to start using our brains. The Pentagon R&D budget is $84 billion a year, just to put this in perspective. Fourth, we need to assist the electrification of the transportation system, and that goes hand in hand with the grid. I think that between algae-based biofuels and the electrified cars, we have a tremendous potential. So when we think of the grid system, we have to think of ways to inspire the production and consumption of electric cars, and that is integral to the grid and make them integrated. The fifth is a question I'll pose, and I do not have the answer to this. A question I have is, should we consider doing for the grid what we did for the interstate freeway system in the 50s and 60s? Should there be a federal financing system to develop this national interconnectivity that we need, with a financial structure through the United States government and perhaps some way to finance that through the U.S., or should this be done just by the kind of things that I am now proposing in the stimulus package? By the way, before people forget, one of the really important things we hope to do in the stimulus package, at least what I hope to do, is to increase bonding authority for the federal power marketing agencies, which is an enormous boost of economic activity if they can go out and bond for these new construction projects, which they can do fairly quickly. Is that what we should be doing, or should we be thinking more boldly with federal involvement? I don't have an answer to that, but we certainly did some good things with the federal highway system, and at least we ought to think about that. So those are 5 ideas I'd put on the table, and thanks a lot for a great panelist for joining us. And NDN.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And these are just some of the issues that we hope to continue exploring this afternoon. Our next speaker, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, has also been deeply involved in these issues over the years and has also worked extensively on transportation issues. He is currently a member of the Ways and Means Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Climate Change. So, Congressman Blumenauer, we'd like to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you. Well, Jay, I think it's better that the sleep therapists are using your book than your speeches. So I think you ought to take some small comfort in that. We welcome you to an interesting phase of what's going on in Washington, and I think it illustrates the most important principle is that in Washington you make your own reality. There are lots of people that are running around loose, making comfortable livings, doing odd sorts of things that a few years ago nobody would have thought possible. Part of what's happened with some political forces that Jay and I have been working against is that people have been very successful in creating their own reality, but it's ended up driving the economy into a ditch and threatening the planet. As was referenced, I've spent a long time working on issues of transportation and livability. Of necessity, it deals with energy and its utilization, land use. These things are all connected. What I found interesting is that these issues a few years ago were kind of left coast. It's nice, livable communities, that's probably a good thing, stabilizing neighborhoods. Maybe it's good for the long-term economy. To where they went from the interesting and the desirable to the necessary, and now they are the urgent. The only way that we're going to be able to deal with the combined challenges of global warming, an economy that is in free fall, and significant disagreement in some areas about the direction to go, will be having an approach to rebuild and renew America where every step results in reducing the carbon footprint. We had a conference yesterday in Chicago where we had people from all over that mega region thinking about the challenges that they face in moving forward. We've had them in Baltimore, in New York, in Los Angeles. It's fascinating watching people starting to move forward, sensing that the time has come. The fact is we know exactly what to do. Jay could have taken his 5-point list and made it 25. And there are a bunch of people in this room who have been working on these things for years or are associated with companies that are ready to go. These are absolutely essential to rescuing the economy and saving the planet. We need to hook to the bailout. You know, we've made roughly $1 trillion of commitments with no discernible effect on the economy other than more people are in line. But it is an unparalleled opportunity for us to harness these resources in ways that are going to make a difference in every community, in ways that are sustainable over time. Part of what we need to do with a new administration and with a Congress that I think is potentially stronger in several respects, but sort of has its feet on the ground, is to make sure that government leads by example. I'm all in favor of increasing CAFE standards to 50 miles per gallon. But if government, starting with the federal government, the largest consumer of energy in the world, says we're not going to buy anything that isn't a plug-in hybrid, a flex fuel vehicle, compressed natural gas, and in fact, we're going to set these, and we're going to start the purchasing in, and you draw a line, whatever it is, that the federal government is not going to build, lease, rent, or buy any structure that isn't green certified with a twist starting in 2 years. Bury it in the operating budgets. It will save the federal government significant resources over time. We all know this. And part of what we need to do is work with certified smart people, some of whom are in this room. It's something I've been pounding away on the Budget Committee and Ways and Means and with our leadership, is that we have to recalculate how we budget, because we have these arcane rules that make it expensive to invest in, for example, energy conservation. That's expensive. My colleague Janine Benner is here. We've spent 7 years trying to work on flood control and disaster mitigation. Because of the stupid way we budget, it's essentially free for the appropriators to spend billions of dollars cleaning up after a disaster, but it's expensive to spend millions in advance to save the billions. Well, the whole value proposition that is attendant to the things that Jay's talking about means that the federal government, which by definition will be here as long as anything else, has the potential to save huge sums of money. It accesses capital, for the time being, cheaper than anybody else in the world. We ought to be able to make these pencil, and it will have a transformational effect. I will resist the temptation to talk about individual bills, but I think we need your help to change the vision of what we are doing. We're not going to throw money at things to just try and prop them up. Our investments are going to be on a new vision about how we rebuild and renew America. You know, in 1808, Albert Gallatin put together a vision for Thomas Jefferson to transform a ragtag group of 13 colonies into a transcontinental nation, having risen above principle to consummate the Louisiana Purchase. And out of that came a guideline that drove what happened through most of the 1800s. The Transcontinental Railroad, public-private partnerships like the Erie Canal, the Homestead Act. It was a vision that served us well. In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt, on the centennial of the Gallatin Plan, convened actually the first meeting in history of the nation's governors, had his own conference. And out of that came some interesting things dealing with massive hydro projects. The National Park Service planted the seeds for the interstate highway system that were kind of nurtured in his cousin Franklin's basement and signed into law by President Eisenhower. 1808, 1908, you can see where this is going. It's time, with a new administration in 2008, with your help, to craft a vision that is commensurate with our challenge to the economy and to the planet. It is partially about resources, and I think part of what we need to look at, and I think there are a variety of ways that we can go at it to get the money necessary to do it right. But it is not primarily about more money. It's extracting more value out of what we're spending now, what we're wasting on inefficient resources, transportation, energy. I would hope that with your help we can zero in on the development of this vision, helping the Obama administration, which has said some of the right things. It's got some good people, and I think is, based on my limited experience with the President-elect, I think he gets this. And then take every one of our tools. Jay mentioned the federal marketing agencies. We got one up in the Northwest. These are slumbering giants that need to be shaken up, turned upside down, use the capacity to be transformational in this energy arena. And I will stop at this point, but I have very strong feelings that you're on the right track and look forward to your conversation.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I think the idea that we have a historic opportunity here is one that we really have to keep in front of us as we go through these issues. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Commissioner John Wellinghoff of FERC. Commissioner Wellinghoff has been a commissioner for a number of years and has been a real leader on renewable issues. Before joining FERC, he was in private practice, but he has extensive experience with these issues in this area, and I believe he's actually going to use PowerPoint, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm going to try. We're going to talk about technology and see how well the technology works here. Actually, I'm going to use Keynote on an Apple. Okay. We'll see if this works here. There we go. Amazing. What I'm going to talk about today is this issue of the backbone transmission system and how that may be effectuated, and how we can use the existing regulatory structures that we have, coupled with some of these new initiatives we've heard from the Congressman this afternoon, together in a way that hopefully we can get that structure that we need to put renewables on the grid and to improve the grid, to make it a smart system that ultimately can deliver these resources to loads in an efficient way. But if we look at, for example, the proposals for transmission lines in the western United States. These are proposals that have come into FERC from various companies on this map that you see. They're scattered all over the place. They are separate proposals by individual distinct companies with their own parochial company interests in mind, and not necessarily a national interest in mind overall. They're looking to FERC for a number of reasons. One is, as Congressman Inslee talked about, the cost allocation issue, and that's an area that FERC has jurisdiction over, and how that cost allocation is going to be done. And it's very important with how these lines can get built, or whether or not they do get built, and also the issue of interconnection, of how you ensure that you can interconnect renewables to these lines and make sure that the lines deliver the resources from the areas where they're constrained and the resources are located to the areas of load. So I think one of the most interesting maps is this one, which shows you the 500 kVA lines and above in this country. And as you can see from the map, they're all either on the west coast or the east coast. Of course, those are where the load centers are. They're also in the northwest, where we had the federal hydro projects that delivered power out of the dams there that were built in the 30s and 40s. And we have considerable lines in the southeast, where there are a substantial amount of nuclear power plants. But as you can see, throughout the whole Midwest of this country, there are virtually no high voltage transmission lines. And also, if you overlaid on this map where the wind is, all the wind is in the middle of this country, in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, Wyoming, Texas, all those areas where currently we do not have sufficient transmission to deliver it to the load centers and the population centers on the east and west coast. 78% of the electric use is in states that touch the coasts of the United States. If you look at this map, this is a proposed high voltage backbone transmission line, and I question, is this the one we need and want? It's I think, a good start. It's a proposal that was done under the auspices of DOE and the National Renewable Energy Lab by NREL, by American Electric Power and the American Wind Energy Association. What they're proposing here with the green lines on this map that overlays the wind energy map of NREL is putting in this high voltage 765 kV backbone line throughout the country. And this would deliver the major wind resources in the Midwest and in Texas, Oklahoma, to the coastal areas where we need this power. But let's remember this. Politics is more difficult than physics, according to Albert Einstein. I think he was right there. So if we look at that, let's try to break down how we can move forward with doing a line that will serve the needs of this country. I would submit that first, before we build the infrastructure, we need to define the goals. What I've put up here is a chart that was done by Google recently. It's up on their website, and this is a proposed national energy plan by Google from current 2008 to 2030 that provides, at the top part of that chart in yellow, substantial amounts of energy efficiency, demand response, energy conservation to be put in place, then adding to that wind and geothermal and solar, and backing off coal plants and other fossil fuel using plants. But ultimately, if we're going to design that backbone transmission line, we have to know where we're going. So I think we need initially that plan to determine how to get there. And from there, after you define the goals, you need to systematically design the solution. So if we look at our goals as being putting on these renewables, including wind at 20% proposed by OEA, and there's others, state of California is looking at a 33% renewable standard that would put wind at a much higher level, putting on geothermal, concentrating solar power and central solar PV, hydro and hydrokinetic systems that are becoming very advanced now and in the early stages of deployment, and ultimately I think will be commercialized off the shores of eastern and western United States, as well as potentially in rivers. FERC right now has 3,000 megawatts of applications for hydrokinetic systems in the Mississippi River alone. So it's really a substantial advancement in these types of technologies. But in addition to these location-constrained resources that have to be part of this grid design, I would maintain that we also have to look at what I call distributed resources, which includes solar PV on the homes and businesses throughout this country, combined heat and power and power and heat combined, which is my way of saying waste heat recovery, energy efficiency. These are all things that are all part of that Google plan. And in addition to those, there's another subcategory of distributed resources that are extremely important that I call, in essence, the glue of the system, which include demand response, or you can think of it as dispatchable conservation, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that you can think of as, in essence, mobile storage, and other storage systems like flywheels, batteries, hydrogen compressed air, etc. Why is this the glue? Because if we're going to put all that wind on the system, that wind has to be balanced and regulated and sustained so that grid stays up and operating. There's a couple of ways to do that. One way to do it is to build a bunch more gas combustion turbines. That's the way we do it right now. But that's a very environmentally intensive way to do it, a very capital intensive way to do it, provides very little benefits to consumers. If we do it instead through demand response, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and these other dispatchable resource means, we can do it cheaper, we can do it faster, and we can do it in a way that's less environmentally damaging. So it's very important to understand, if we're going to build a national backbone transmission grid in this system, don't forget the demand side. Don't forget dispatchable resources that I call the glue of how to make that overall system work. So also, when you design the solution, you need to consider critical parameters for that solution. One is reliability. That grid has to be reliable. Another is markets. How is that grid and those resources going to fit into our existing markets? And we have a combination of markets right now in this country. We have organized wholesale markets and ISOs and RTOs, and we have other areas where those markets are not organized in the southeast and in the northwest and in the west primarily. So how are the delivery of those resources going to interface with those markets? That's going to be critical. Ownership and financing is going to be an issue. Operation, and there's two aspects to operation. Operation from a political standpoint, that is it going to be independently operated? Is it going to be operated by a governmental entity? Is it going to be operated by traditional utilities? How will that backbone grid be operated? And then operationally, from an efficiency standpoint, how will it be operated to maximize efficiency on a national basis? We need to optimize nationally. We can't optimize simply on discrete local areas or discrete regional areas. We need to ensure that that grid is operating as efficiently as possible on a national basis. We have to look at cost allocation and cost recovery. That's an essential issue. Total system efficiency, again, operationally, not with respect to just the grid, but also those aspects of the grid that it interconnects to, including not only the resources on one end, but the loads on the other end, and how those efficiencies going to be optimized through energy efficiency and through operational activities as well. Implementation of the glue. How are we going to get the glue going? We're going to need some incentives and other ways, I think, from the federal government to ensure that we have adequate demand response, that we have adequate ability to encourage our auto manufacturers to start making plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and that we have adequate incentives for storage and other aspects as well. And then ultimately the impact of deployment of the distributed resources. That's going to be important, because how much solar PV is put on the homes and businesses in this country is going to impact the size of that grid. The more that's put on locally on a distributed basis is going to impact how big we need the grid to be ultimately. We don't want to overbuild the grid. We don't want to make it twice as big as it needs to be if we find out that 5 years from now the economics have turned around and it makes sense for every time that you buy a house to just simply roll in the cost of a new PV system and put it on the house. And that's going to happen 5 to 10 years from now, probably less than 10 years from now. I would maintain in perhaps less than 5 from some of the information I got recently. So the impact of the deployment of those distributed resources is going to be essential to determining how to ultimately design, build, finance that grid. So how does FERC get into all this? Well, FERC has a number of areas of current transmission authority. We have planning under 890 that I'll go over in a minute. We have siting authority that's very limited under the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridor section of the 2005 EPAC. We have interconnection authority that I alluded to, reliability authority, and cost allocation and pricing authority. With respect to our transmission planning, Our process, which is under Order 890, is a regional transmission planning process that in that order we, in fact, indicated to in the order to all transmission owners and operators that they had to engage in regional transmission planning. So it applies to every interstate transmission system, not only the RTOs and ISOs, but also transmission systems outside of that. It's an open, transparent, coordinated, and regional process, and supply and demand are to be considered on a comparable basis in that regional process. There are other processes around the country. There are states that have IRPs, and in addition to integrated resource planning processes. In addition, California has a renewable transmission planning process going as well as Texas, as was mentioned previously. There's also a Western Governor's transmission planning process that's underway, and a transmission planning process that's underway by the Eastern ISOs and RTOs. So there's multiple processes operating. It's a matter of how do we coordinate and focus these transmission planning processes in a way that we get to the goals that we want to achieve. Interconnection rules, here's an area, again, we need flexibility, and FERC is working on this flexibility. The traditional rule is first come, first serve. So if you signed up, you're the first one in the queue, you're the first one who's ultimately going to get on that transmission line. Well, that may not make sense if you're building a plant that's going to take you 7 to 8 years to build, where some resource that may be able to come on in 2 or 3 years may be able to better serve the loads and needs. So those rules are being reformed right now in the ISOs and RTOs, and they're looking at things like first ready, first served. They're also looking at an issue of clustering studies. In the past, the studies for getting on the queue were in a serial fashion. The Midwest ISO told us that if they did their studies in this serial fashion for all the wind that's currently queued up to get onto the Midwest ISO's transmission grid, it would take them 150 years to do the studies. So we obviously had a process that was broken. So FERC stepped in and said, look, give us proposals of how we can make this operate in a more efficient, more effective way, and they're now looking at clustering these studies together and doing it in a way that will hopefully make it more efficient for renewable developers to get on the grid. On reliability, under Section 215 of EPAC, FERC has enforcement and oversight authority under that 2005 law. It applies to the entire bulk power system, could apply, in fact, all the way down to the distribution level in some instances. We have enforceable rules, and there is a national reliability organization that FERC has designated, which is the North American Electric Reliability Council. So FERC does have full authority and responsibility over reliability. It's essential when we build this national grid, we ensure that it maintains that reliability throughout the country. Building transmission infrastructure, the key really is cost allocation and pricing. Historical view is beneficiary pays. We're looking, though, however, in some ISOs now to allowing to spread the cost over building new high-voltage lines. So this is potentially a way we could spread the costs of a backbone line across the country, as Congressman Inslee has indicated and has proposed in some legislation. I think it's something we definitely need to look at. We're also looking at locational constrained resources and how we can bring them to market better. And there was a Tehachapi decision that FERC came out with in California, in the Tehachapi area where there's significant amounts of wind, but multiple developers. No one developer was big enough, however, to be able to bear the full cost of a backbone line to get that wind out of that Tehachapi area into the load centers in Los Angeles. So what FERC said under that order, under a proposal given to us by the California ISO, was that the costs could be borne initially by all the ratepayers in the area, and then as the developers came on, they could pay back those costs. And so it was a way to sort of get out of the chicken and the egg problem that we had with developing transmission there. And another one is the pipeline analogy, where ultimately you look at the idea of an open season and an anchor shipper, where if you can get a group of renewable developers who ultimately could come on and take capacity in a new transmission line like we do with pipelines now, and FERC has full authority over siting interstate gas pipelines. In fact, we've certificated, cited, and there's been built over 11,000 miles of gas pipelines in the last 8 years versus approximately 630 miles of 230 kV electric lines in that same time. So it shows you the contrast and how far we are behind in actually building new transmission systems. So conclusions: to modernize the grid, we need to define our goals. We need to establish a national transmission planning process and use a system approach that considers all critical parameters. We need to determine ownership and structure for financing and operation. We need to solve the cost allocation and pricing issue. We need to determine how to implement that glue. It's the part that people forget about, but it's very important. I think Boone Pickens forgot about it in his plan. And we need to determine the siting process overall. And I guess I got one more, and that's do it. We just need to get it done. So with that, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Be great. And excuse me, and just let me say, that presentation will be up on my FERC website, FERC.gov. Then you just go to my individual page, and you can find that. It'll be up this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. That was extraordinarily in-depth, and one of the reasons that we've identified this whole issue of the grid and utility, I won't say reform, but trying to understand utility regulation is because this is so central to all of these alternative energy proposals. The greatest technologies that are being developed in Silicon Valley, none of the huge wind farms that are being developed in the Midwest, none of these things will really work unless we get the regulation and the politics, as you said it, right. So our next speaker is an expert on electricity. Kurt Yeager was the executive director of EPRI, which is the institution which conducts a great deal of R&D for the entire utility and electricity industry in the United States, and he is now the director of the Galvin Electricity Initiative, which is looking at many of the same issues. So if anyone knows a great deal about the electricity industry in the United States, it's Kurt Yeager. So Kurt, please tell us your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. And first, let me commend Congressman Inslee and his colleagues for their leadership in getting us off the dime on this very critical issue. Just by moment of background, the concept of energy independence goes back a long ways. I was the point person in EPA in 1974 for the first Project Independence. And the one thing that I would really try to underscore to Congress and to all the staff is we cannot afford to let our energy policy be driven by the cost of the moment of gasoline at the pump, which is basically how it has operated throughout this period. I have been in a number of these very good sessions, and once the price goes down at the pump, the concept of energy goes away. Now, the important thing here that has been underscored, and I think it must be really underscored, is the relationship of energy, specifically electricity, to our national economy. So this crisis that we have today, a very real one from an economic standpoint, is an opportunity that cannot be lost. Electricity must be viewed as much more than just energy. It is the lifeblood of our economy and quality of life. It's the basis by which we can convert every form of raw energy into the goods and services that our economy produces and that we consume. It is, if done properly, the most efficient mechanism for the transformation of those raw energy sources, and most importantly, it is the basis for innovation. The whole 20th century and everything that has transformed, there's been more change in our society and our economy in a global basis in the 20th century than in all of history preceding that. And the reason, fundamental reason, was the commercialization of electricity. So that has been a tremendous accelerator. And I would suggest that as important as electricity was to the 20th century, it'll be even more importantly the 21st, because we must go from an economy that based on consumption to one that is based on sustainability. And it is only through the wise, smart use of electricity that we will get there. Regrettably, the electricity system of this country is one that has been deprived largely of innovation for decades. Literally, before the first Project Independence, innovation in electricity ceased. It had been, electricity and the infrastructure was the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century, according to the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering. But over these last decades, it has fallen into a tremendous abyss of poor performance. Today, for example, this system unnecessarily wastes more energy each year than Japan consumes. The unreliability, the outages, not just the lights going out, but the impacts on our digital system, cost us well over $100 billion a year. And when you stack this up in a global economy, and you look at the impact of this on productivity and competitiveness, it's costing us over $1 trillion a year in our economy. So we're talking about real money here. Now, you take 1 year of just that unreliability and even a portion of the inefficiency, and you reinvest it in transforming the system into what is broadly known as a smart system, and those costs would be largely eliminated. So the payback is almost instantaneous. This is literally a no-brainer. In fact, I did the analogy to my granddaughter, one of my granddaughter's third grade classes. I said, if you had a railroad and it took you 10 days to open or close a switch, would you call that a smart railroad? No, that'd be a dumb railroad. Why would anyone ever want to build a railroad like that? And this is third graders. But because they know trains and they can see them running. We can't see electricity, but that's what we have today. We have an electricity delivery system that is equivalent of a railroad that takes 10 days to open or close a switch. We think those switches open quick, because we see them, they snap like when we turn the lights off on the wall, but they're still mechanical switches. And relative to the speed of light that the energy is flowing, that's equivalent to a 10-day delay. So we literally have no control over where energy goes. We cannot control an outage until it spreads over half the country. So all of that is the problem. Now, enough of the problem here. I was delighted, and I think Commissioner Wellinghoff's, particularly his closing slide, is a wonderful, if you will, systematic view of the world. And the smart grid transformation, while there's a lot of talk about transmission, and that's important, that is insufficient. That is like building an interstate highway system, but leaving all the roads in the cities and communities as unpaved, one-lane paths without any traffic signals. And that's about where we are today. Literally, the power system that we have today, particularly at the distribution level, was one that was designed in the 19th century. So if we, and it is this distribution system that I want to focus on a bit, and I'm very glad that, again, Commissioner Wellinghoff underscored this, that just bringing a lot of power from wind sources or other sources and dumping it at the doorstep of communities is not going to solve our problem. In fact, it will make it fundamentally worse. It has to be part of a comprehensive transformation that brings technology, particularly to each of our homes, and eliminates what I call the iron curtain of the grid today, the meter as we know it, and makes that meter a gateway. And a smart system, let me say here without getting into any technology, a smart system is one in which gives consumers the smarts. It gives you and I the opportunity to control our destiny as we do with every other business. A system that was designed in the early part of the 20th century with rules that still are controlled at the state level with the goal of simply dumping electricity at our gates is not what we need today. So the biggest impediment to the transformation is neither technology nor cost. Both of those are there waiting for us. It is obsolete state regulatory barriers and disincentives that literally echo back to the New Deal era. And at that time, they were probably the right answer. But like everything else, it had its day, and it is time for us to come up with a new deal, one that is focused on consumers and that will get consumers in control of their destiny. In most states, the regulations continue to reward utilities simply for selling more energy, rather than for the efficiency, reliability, and quality of service. As a result, power outages and massive energy inefficiencies remain a way of life in the United States, well beyond that which most of our other developed nations in the world experience. And as we look at developing countries, China is moving well beyond us. They have the benefit of a clean sheet of paper, but that is not something that should hold us back. And it is that greatest source of unreliability is not the transmission system, it is the local distribution systems. And the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act set the right tone, but I would suggest that it is far too passive in its messages to the states. A comment was made before, and I certainly support it, that we need something, at least in concept, equivalent to the Interstate Highway Act. Again, the issue here is not principally interstate highway alone, it's the whole system. But while I'm a strong believer in states' rights, there comes a time when the national good and the welfare of every consumer and citizen has to come first. And I think any plan to fund, if you will, I don't like to use the term bailout, I think it should be to fund, to stimulate what is a very quick return in terms of modernizing our power system, has to be one which has some very strong requirements placed on the states. And those states have to, again, enable consumers to become active participants rather than being held captive, in which the regulator is the consumer, in effect. We have to establish fundamentally higher reliability standards. The standards today that guide or control our distribution system aren't worth the paper they're written on. We don't even count outages that are less than several minutes in length. In a digital society, a fraction of a second can make all the difference to whether your assembly line stays up or not and how much you have to pay for extra energy to keep it up. So we also ought to be providing consumers with time of use rates and the incentives to use those rates, rather than an average system that, again, does not reward the good use of energy. And we should be enabling what we would call in the Galvin initiative smart microgrids that allow us to aggregate buildings, working with utilities, not in conflict with them, but with utilities, to begin to modernize the distribution system by bringing in entrepreneurial organizations who have both the technology and the money, just as we did in telecommunications, and begin to modernize that system. And I'm pleased that in actually a leading state is the state of Illinois, where we're working on perhaps most aggressively today in writing a new electricity constitution, which enables that very change, allows and encourages communities to have much more control over their destiny without necessarily taking over their power system, but being able to work as partners rather than as simply as hostages to the local system. And if we want, and we definitely do, we want zero energy buildings. We want plug-in hybrid vehicles. We want all of these capabilities. We want distributed generation, converting our buildings into power plants. All of that is a very much of a reality today that we can achieve, but we cannot do it until we transform the local distribution systems and enable consumers not only to be captive consumers, but to be producers and partners in terms of modernizing and in terms of getting the benefits, economic and otherwise, of this transformation. Thank you very much. I look forward to a stimulating discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And our last speaker is Reid Detchon, who is Executive Director for Energy and Climate Change at the United States, United Nations Foundation. He's also Executive Director of the Energy Future Coalition. So, what you have to say.
When we started the Energy Future Coalition shortly after 9/11, we tried to identify what topics were the most urgently needed and where we could find agreement across usual constituency lines. The idea behind the Energy Future Coalition was to bring together business, labor, and the environmental community around common goals and to try to break through the policy stalemate that was characterizing the energy debate at that time. And the smart grid came up right at the beginning because it seemed like such an obvious place. You could bring together organized labor around good jobs. You could bring together the environmental community around the efficiency and environmental benefits, the opportunity for distributed renewable resources, and most importantly at that time, and one that hasn't been talked about much today, you could address the incredibly obvious vulnerabilities of the grid to sabotage. Osama bin Laden explicitly identified the electric power grid of the United States as a vulnerability that he would encourage exploitation of. And without going into detail, the ability of somebody with relatively crude methods to bring down entire regions of this country for weeks, if not months, is quite alarming. As Kurt said, the grid today is one that Edison would have recognized. And when we have a digital economy, that's just not acceptable. And we've seen you go to Korea and see the cell phone difference between them and us. The grid is next. The grid is going to be an empowering tool like the internet that is going to facilitate change across the whole spectrum of the economy in ways that we cannot predict. But one example, the most obvious example that's really coming to the fore now is the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. That if you want to get the United States off oil, electricity is the most obvious and attractive answer. If you want to use electricity in your vehicles, not only do you have to have the capacity to deliver it, but you want to have two-way communication so that when your car comes down to the office and you either plug in to give your power back or to take more off, it's going to know who you are and credit your bill accordingly. It creates a set of economies that are extraordinarily attractive, and the essential underpinning of that, as with all these things, is a smart digital grid. I think Commissioner Wellinghoff ran through some of the critical issues on the transmission side, and Kurt Yeager ran through some of the opportunities on the distribution side. We at the Energy Future Coalition are trying to put together in the next couple of months, on the basis of the work we've done in the past, on the basis of the relationship we have with folks, particularly at Van Ness Feldman, who have been general counsels at FERC and at the Department of Energy, and on the basis of really the extraordinary outburst of interest and attention this is receiving right now, after we've sort of toiled in the vineyard here for several years without notice. I think that people recognize the political significance of the investment in this area, the opportunity for job creation, and the need to invest in our future energy needs. So we've brought together on an informal basis a very broad range of parties, and I'll omit some probably, but I'll mention just to give you a sense of the span. Center for American Progress, the AFL-CIO, people who are currently and recently at DOE, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PG&E, Intel, the National Commission on Energy Policy, the American Wind Energy Association, the Gridwise Alliance. I'll mention Andy Karsner, who was most recently Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewables at the Department and is channeling the T. Boone Pickens crowd. Interestingly enough, Al Gore has taken on this issue and very quietly has had several sessions in Nashville on how to do this. So we're bringing his group in, as well as the National Wildlife Federation and others from the environmental community. So you think about the issues you have to address that have been brought up: cost allocation, access to land. How do you give a renewable preference? How do you start to build this out quickly and not in 10 years? How do you address the security concerns of the grid? On Friday, we're going to have Jim Woolsey, the head of NERC, and Jay Cohen from the Department of Homeland Security to talk about those issues. I think that this is an area where there's going to be about 90% consensus, and the last 10% are going to be fought over bitterly. Luckily, that's the job of people in this building. So we'll try to get that 90% put together in a way that we can queue up the debate, because I think this, Jeff Bingaman's mentioned it, I'm sure it'll happen over on this side. This is a topic that's ready to go. We have to get the rules right. As Commissioner Wellinghoff said, but this can really take off in a hurry and be an enormous boon to the country.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Reid, and thank you, everyone. I'd like to exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask the first question, and then we're going to open it up. And Congressman Inslee, I was really struck by your idea of a kind of an electricity superhighway. If you look at the great expansions in American history, they've almost always involved pulling our
in the creation of an interstate system that is truly designed for an interstate public policy, which is to create a new smart grid international system. Clearly, the federal government has an absolutely required role to play in de-balkanizing this entire system. And that is largely through policy and rulemaking and cost sharing and all of the things we talked about that we've had some great ideas about today. That part is obvious. So we need an interstate system, and clearly the federal government is a mandatory player to do that. And by the way, there are obvious tensions when we do this. Anything involving a national effort rubs up and creates friction with our American value that we should be localized down to our own yards and picket fences, and that no one should tell us what we should do within the constraints of our own picket fences or our city municipality or our county or our state. So there are tensions, and I've already rubbed up against this in the little time of works we've tried to do. You know, when we've tried to pass a decoupling provision to allow utilities to sell efficiency rather than electrons, boom, the first pushback we get from state utility commissioners and utility folks is, wait a minute, you're treading on my holy ground that for, since Tesla and Edison were arguing, has always been a local issue. But I think it is clear that we now have not only a national but a global challenge involving global warming and a national problem of national security that demands a national grid system. So I think that part is clear as to what the federal involvement has to be. What is unclear to me is whether the federal government ought to have a specific financing mechanism itself for the creation and capital construction costs of this national grid, like we did in the interstate freeway system. There are two ways we can do this. One, we can make it easier for utilities and private developers to have access to capital, and that's why I have this provision that I hope will be in the stimulus bill when it passes in January, which will increase the bonding authority dramatically for the power marketing associations, which can free up huge amounts of capital for construction fairly early. It is clear in my mind we should do that. But the next question is, and I'll pose it to everybody else on this panel, should we have a national revenue source to specifically fund this construction like we did in the interstate freeway system that actually paid for the concrete out of federal revenues? That is a big step. It is a big change, and I don't know the answer to that, and frankly haven't thought through it all, but it's one that I thought was worthy of consideration.
Very interesting. Any thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the Energy Independence and Security Act, which put in there a cost-sharing or fund matching process to assist states in getting moving on this. I think the payback is so great that it makes it almost a no-brainer, but it only works, again, if the states are held accountable to do certain things. If it's just a free lunch, if you will, a handout, and they do what they want with it, that won't work. So there has to be some very strict standards associated with it, which I think was the way that the Interstate Highway Act was. Is states could get money, but they had to do certain things or they didn't get it. And I think that's basically the logic that has to be applied here. I believe, we need two things here. We need the top-down federal leadership. I've worked in this industry for 40 years, and it's not going to happen at the state level. I just don't believe it. It's not mean that states and regulators all are bad people at all. They're just not motivated, and they're not there to make that kind of a transformative change. It's maintain the status quo as long as I can, and maybe my successor will have to can deal with the change. We have to deal with change now, transformative change. And the other side of that is raising the consciousness of the public. As I say, I use that simple analogy. When people begin to understand some of those things and they understand how much money it is costing them every year, you think your electricity bill, that's only the tip of what you're paying. We pride ourselves, again, at the state level, boy, we've kept electricity prices down. No, What we've done is push the cost of electricity off of the electricity bill and off into everything else we pay and buy. So that for that dollar you spend on electricity, you're spending a couple more dollars unnecessarily in waste, in unreliability, and a good deal more than that in uncompetitiveness. So those are the things that people have to, I think, legitimately understand, and when they are given that information, I think you'll get all the support in the world that you need to do this.
Congressman Inslee appropriately pointed to the tension between state and federal relations here, and I think Kurt's suggestion of splitting the baby is about right. I think that if you use a mandate, you're going to create a war, but incentives can be effective. Just a factoid that would be useful to you all, we consume roughly 4 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity a year in the country, so a 1 mil charge on electricity usage generates $4 billion a year. So if you're thinking about essentially a $100 billion project, using just a 1 mil charge as a federal share of a 50-50 match or a 40-60 match, you can start to think about $8 to $10 billion a year, which is probably about the right rate to be carrying this on looking forward.
Okay, why don't we open it up? I'm sure that a lot of you have questions. Gentleman in the back. Oh, yes, yes, sure. An emergency, yes.
I'd be happy to try that one and answer the technical question and then give you my opinion on the political one. But on the technical one, I try to factor in Amory's writings and thoughts on everything I do. I'm a great fan of Amory. And with respect to this issue of the glue that I talked about, that's one of the big issues that Amory emphasizes, and that is distributed generation, distributed resources, and how important they are to the entire system. On the issue of AC lines versus DC lines, it's true that AC systems can, in fact, transport power much more efficiently with much fewer losses generally. However, as we get to higher voltages in AC lines, like a 765 or even, as the Chinese are doing, 1,000 kVA lines, you can reduce those losses substantially where there almost isn't a difference. But the difference is it's much more difficult to tap into a DC line in multiple places because you have to then convert back to AC, and that's very expensive. So there's a trade-off there, and it's usually more flexible to look at AC if you can lower the losses with higher voltages. On the political issue, let me talk about that from back to the cost allocation issue. You know, that's one of the most contentious issues that comes before FERC is cost allocation. And I think we have to eliminate that as a political issue by trying to spread costs in some way. We have a universal service charge on our telephone bill. I don't see why we can't do some similar thing that would ultimately pay for the transmission we need in this country to deliver the renewable resources to loads and also make the grid an efficient, intelligent grid that can operate in the best interests of everybody.
And yes, Kurt?
Oh, just a quick, I'm glad you brought up DC. If we had the benefit of a clean sheet of paper today, with today's technology, the whole system would be DC. DC is another legacy, part of our legacy system that goes back to the 1930s. Every digital device runs on DC. Every renewable energy source effectively produces direct current. Most of the sources of unreliability are fluctuations in the sine wave of the transmission. So, and in fact, if I went back next door, people, Hewlett Packard, and they say, you know, we could build computers, you know, large and small, for about the cost of of your pocket calculator, if we could get, because most of it has nothing to do with the microchip. Most of it has to do with power conditioning and conversion and all of that. And so that just gives you strategically the kind of opportunity. The microgrids that we're working about, one of our purposes of microgrids is to be able to introduce direct current, again, at the retail end, bringing it in stepwise. You can't obviously replace everything overnight. But any of you who go out in boats and all the equipment, the refrigerators, everything else on a boat is DC. So the technology's there. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Dave McCurdy, Dave. Thanks for Indian work. I think there is an opportunity with the administration to actually get past this binary argument that we seem to have had for decades now. And I think a couple points that were made were good ones about how we've had a policy probably of cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap energy in this country. And there is a crisis and provides an opportunity for us to work. A couple questions, statement first, battery technology, we talk about plug-ins, and we are moving rapidly now, but we still don't have the lithium-ion technology that's yet reliable or able to warrant. We have a mini electric last night that has lithium-ion. It's a great opportunity, but far from being produced. And the other question is the infrastructure that supports that. That's what you're trying to address. There's often great promise about infrastructure, but it's chicken and the egg. This is where we need to focus. And the real question for you, Joe, is really that of the price signals. You mentioned that what happens when you have cheap gas. When we were at $4 gas, that was more incentive for the auto sector to move to advanced technologies than anything we've ever done in decades. And there's a concern that as the price declines, the price signal goes away, and consumers will all of a sudden say, you know, maybe it's not as imperative or critical that we move. And the last point is just on jurisdiction. We don't have to mention preemption. I don't think we have talked about it, but I do think we have a concern about getting this collaborative approach and getting this jurisdiction clarified.
Well, first, within about 20 to 30 years, Dave, we will have forgiven Oklahoma for stealing the Seattle Supersonics. I just want you to know. That won't color my answer at all. A couple comments. On the battery technology, I think that that this is absolutely a critical national security and economic issue to seize the advances in battery technology that are possible. Little story, a guy has a company in Indiana, that has the capacity to be the first domestic manufacturer of the lithium-ion battery. And I think they have a very viable business plan, and he's ready to go. But a guy from China came in, you know, a few months ago and offered him $300 million cash to move his operation to China. The Chinese understand that they have the capacity, if they and the Koreans become the dominant electric battery, lithium-ion battery manufacturers, we will have traded our addiction to Saudi Arabian oil to an addiction to Chinese lithium-ion batteries. That is not a route we want to go down. And just to let folks know how important that is, when the car is substantially electrified, the battery will represent 50% of the manufacturing value of the entire car. So the battery will represent half of, if you think of what the auto industry is to America, the battery industry will represent half of that, I believe, in the next couple of decades. So we have a national interest in seizing the moment and not giving up this incredible market to some of our Asian competitor friends. To that end, in the last stimulus bill that we passed, I and others got in a loan guarantee program for $1 billion loan guarantee for domestic manufacturers, which leverages $3 billion of investment. In our next stimulus package, I hope that that will be a portion or even a larger portion. I think this is absolutely critical moment. By the way, once this sort of manufacturing locus is out the door, it's not coming back. This is one of those short terms. We got to seize the moment. Carpe battery, you know. Second approach, I'll note that it's not just the battery, it's the distribution system. There is another approach to electrified vehicles. This company called Better Place, many may be familiar with it, where their approach is let's not wait for a 200-mile capacity battery. Let's just go build charging stations around the country. They've now signed contracts with Israel, Denmark, and Australia, and they're looking in the U.S., frankly, for sites to do the same thing. So there's another way to get there. So you talked about the price point, and you were entirely correct. John and others talked about that. I think any manufacturer or any investor should have one lead pipe assumption they should make, which is that we are going to live in a carbon-constrained world. There will be a cost associated with carbon. It's going to happen. Whether that happens in August next year or December next year or August of 2010, I can't tell you exactly, but I think it is absolutely a lead pipe cinch that we will be having a price associated with carbon. Now, the cap and trade system has been criticized as having an uncertain price on carbon, because in a cap and trade system, the costs associated with carbon fluctuate with the market. Nonetheless, I believe it is the right approach because it uses a market mechanism to determine the cost associated with carbon. But there will be a cost, and I think anyone making a major investment in this country should be, or could be, charged with malfeasance in not making that working assumption. So that's what I would recommend.
And I would add that if you look at what's going on in the auto industry, a lot of it has to be the uncertainty about gas prices. So even though they've tumbled and it's really not that expensive to fill up a tank anymore, there's still the uncertainty, which together with the situation in the loan markets has just hobbled the car industry. So it's true that over time we may forget about these high prices, but the volatility itself is a real problem going forward. Let's see, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
I'm interested in, because I live in a state that is coal mining and has nuclear power, what y'all think of nuclear power and supposedly clean coal?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure there are others as well, but I will. First of all, two things we need to remember. The United States is the richest nation in the world in terms of energy resources. We should be a net energy exporter, not importer. The fact that we've allowed ourselves to fall in this trap is terrible. And we dam the energy sources, we should be damming the technology. Coal and nuclear power are absolutely essential to the future energy, a sustainable energy future for this nation, and more importantly, even for the world in the 21st century. I'm a strong supporter of renewable energy, but we are not going to switch overnight to renewable energy. I do not believe this world will be running on renewable energy, certainly not in my lifetime, and I would argue perhaps not in very many lifetimes to people in this room. I hope I'm wrong. But we had better assure our future generations, not deprive them of the option of coal and nuclear. India and China are going to develop and are developing their economies entirely on coal. They are not using smart technology. They're not incented to do it today. Nuclear power can be as safe and as non-proliferable as we decide we want to make it. The technology is there to enable that to happen. Not by tomorrow, but we need to get on with it today and set some goals and say, we want to have the broadest possible portfolio of energy sources that are safe, practical, affordable for sustainable use by all of our citizens in this century. That should be a fundamental goal. And we should not be picking favorites except based on how the technology evolves. End of speech.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, one does two quick related questions. One is, how do you see batteries stacking up over the next 1, 2, 3 years against some of this other competition? The second part of the question is, how do you see Mr. Buffett's $230 million into BYD, and then 3 weeks later they announced releasing in the next 3 weeks the $22,000 electric car, which I'm sure will have problems in the beginning, but may scale up quite a bit, you know, pretty quickly.
I might try that because I was at A123 a few months ago, and they got the coolest thing in their lobby. This is in Cambridge. It's a videotape of the world's fastest motorcycle, which is driven on a lithium-ion battery. And you see this motorcycle, and all of a sudden it's like gone. It's like a bullet takes off. So they're pretty impressive. You know, I think there's multiple people that have options. A123 is one of them. I can't scientifically assess their relative capabilities. I know the domestic manufacturers are sort of holding a competition amongst a number of manufacturers. And I think the people at A123, it's an incredible American story where they've had some people that grew up in China and some people who grew up in, I think it was, you know, Turkey or somewhere, and came here to develop this incredible technology. It's a great American story, but at the moment they don't plan domestic manufacturing. And I think we legitimately ought to have policies that encourage domestic manufacturing, both in our tax policies and our loan guarantee programs. And I think that we ought to focus for the reasons I indicated in answering Dave's questions. I'm not familiar with what you were talking about, Dave, so I'll have to about Mr. Buffett's investment. I'll have to pass on that one.
Is that a Chinese company you're talking about?
Yeah, BYD.
Yes. China has about 100 car companies currently, and there's every reason to expect that we'll see Chinese cars, in particular electric cars, which they've targeted. Hopefully we'll see the GM Volt before the first Chinese cars come here, but that's a very important point that you mentioned, and that relates to the whole question of ownership and how many jobs that these new technologies produce here in the United States as opposed to in other countries.
But by the way, let me add some. I may have misspoken. A123 actually had some discussions about them, about the potential of domestic manufacturing if we had some incentive programs in that regard. So I don't write them off, but we may need some incentives to make that happen. It's one of the reasons I'm supporting these.
I was in Jiading, which is an hour outside of Shanghai, where the Chinese were making the initiative 5 months ago, and they really have, the Minister of Science and Technology's whole focus is to make China the Detroit of the world in renewables and hybrids. So I think we're going to be in a very competitive situation in trying to, you know, and it ties in with the auto situation right now. So I think it's a question to keep an eye on.
To add to that, the Chinese are already way ahead of us. In China, there are 40 million electric vehicles today. Now, those 40 million vehicles are primarily scooters and motorcycles, but, you know, from the standpoint of electrification of the transportation system, they're way ahead of us.
One point that, Commissioner, you made earlier that we frequently, or I guess also Congressman Blumenauer made the point that we often spend billions of dollars on cleanup of a project that could have been avoided with millions of dollars of initial expenditure, shows that there is an issue with how we do budgeting. And again, to contrast China and the United States, we have a $700 billion fund basically to address what's happened in the financial markets. And then we did that only because of the turmoil we saw there. China has allocated about $600 billion, which they're putting into infrastructure. So arguably, if we were making, you know, investments of that magnitude in clean infrastructure, we would receive you know, a much greater return than we're getting cleaning up a mess that's already occurred. I want to thank everyone for coming. This is only the first in a series of these types of events that we're going to have. We're going to hold. I want to thank especially Congressman Inslee for convening this, and we look forward to hearing from you and working with you as we go forward to address these issues. Thank you very much. Thank you to our distinguished panelists.